Welcome to the Unconditionally Worthy Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Dee Olateru, a licensed clinical psychologist who believes deeply that you are worthy unconditionally. Hello, and thanks for listening to another episode of the Unconditionally Worthy Podcast. Today on the podcast, we have Dee Olateru, who's the founder of the Rich Immigrant, and we have a great conversation about the experiences and challenges that immigrants have, the challenges and problems with hustle culture, and what it really takes to build a rich life, and rich in terms of finances as well as in other aspects of our lives. It's a really interesting conversation. And so if you have anything in terms of your relationship with money that you think might be a little bit off, if you are buying into hustle culture and feeling like you need to work all of the time, if you are confusing your self-worth with your net worth, this episode is certainly for you. Dee shares a lot of wisdom. She shares some really important reflective questions that you can ask yourself to figure out why you're doing what you're doing and help you get out of this hustle mentality. The reality is that living a rich life does not require hustling. I have certainly experienced that myself, and we want to help you get to a place where you're living a rich life without overworking. So this is a really interesting and dynamic conversation. I know that you're going to enjoy the episode, so let's get into it. So today on the podcast, I am welcoming Dee Olateru, and I'm really excited to have an interesting and engaging conversation with her. Dee is a CPA and an executive at a Big Four professional services firm, where she spent 13 years serving a wide variety of multinational financial services clients. Beginning her career in the U.S., she's gone on to serve some of the firm's largest banking clients on 4 continents. Born and raised in Lagos, Nigeria, Dee is passionate about closing the achievement gap and creating opportunities for others through education. She's a member of the board of directors of College Possible Minnesota. She serves as a mentor for female African entrepreneurs through AWEC. Dee also currently serves as a co-chair for the D&I Network. In the midst of COVID-19, June 2020, she founded The Rich Immigrant, an online financial literacy platform and community established to empower first and second generation immigrants to attain financial independence, lead full lives, and live authentically in the new countries they call home. So thank you so much for being here, and welcome to the podcast, Dee.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited about this conversation.
Me too. I'm wanting us to start where I start all of these conversations with my guests, which is by asking you to share a little bit about your own self-worth journey.
Yeah, and I'm like, wow, she starts with this really hard-hitting question. The way that I would think about it is that my self-worth journey is ongoing. And I think for me, it is a lifelong journey. I think growing up, we never had any conversations about self-worth. I mean, it was focused on your studies, do well in school, get a good education. And as I kind of grew up, I was never like the pretty one or particularly the funny one, though now I think, I got jokes. But, I was never that person in the group. And
I would add that you got looks too.
Thank you. But I was never that person growing up, but I was one that put down her head and got good grades and worked hard. And without even knowing it, that became a part of my identity. And I think for me, it's really been over the last maybe 15 years. So I'm 36 now. So like 21 when I graduated from college. So over the last 15 years or so is when I've had, life events that have caused me to sit with myself. And I'm an analytic by nature, right? So I love to sit with myself and think through things and look at patterns, right? And so for me, it's in those 15 years that I've actually consciously been on a self-worth journey. I think for me, it's involved facing my inner critic because nobody is more critical of me than me. And I'll say that today, I'm in a place where, I know that even though in some seasons my self-esteem may hit rock bottom in certain aspects of my life or certain regards, I can always sit in the knowledge that just by existing, I have intrinsic value and that I am good and that I am good enough and that I am worthy, just as I am and that I'm here for a reason, right? and that my thoughts about my self-worth are not driven by, what I do or how successful I am or what my family thinks or what my culture thinks, right? Or relate to any performance that I may put on, right?
Yeah.
And maybe the last thing I'll say about my self-worth journey is that it has changed, right? Knowing I'm worthy as I am has changed how I show up, how I make decisions, how I show up at work, how I show up, in decision making, not making decisions from a place of fear or lack or worry. It shows up in relationships, what I'm willing to, fight for and what I'm willing to let go of. And I think it's shown up most importantly in how I see myself. And I look at myself now, I'm like, wow, man, I'm glad we got here.
Yes.
Right.
I love that. I mean, you touched on so many things that I think so many people can relate to. One, the sort of self-criticism, which bogs us all down. It's so common, right? And we just get we tear ourselves down, and we usually are way harder on ourselves than we are on anyone else. And then also sort of the achievement, the sort of growing up feeling like, okay, my worth is dependent on what I achieve. Like I make my family proud or I make myself proud by achieving, and that's what makes me worthy. And so it's really wonderful to hear that you've dismantled those things and that you connect to your worth as a human, your intrinsic value, and who you are and what you are here to bring into the world. So it's really powerful for you to hear you say those sort of affirmations of being unconditionally worthy. So I appreciate you sharing those with us, and then also highlighting that has shifted how you show up in the world, right? I think sometimes people believe, well, if I believe I'm worthy, then I'll, get lazy or, then I won't show up. And it's just really selfish. But the truth is that when we embrace the fact that we're worthy, that actually helps us to show up and share our gifts and, engage in the world in a much more helpful, fruitful way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll say, like I said, it's ongoing. There's still some patterns that show up, but at least I have the awareness to recognize it, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'd love, since you sort of have this brand around being a rich immigrant, I'd love for you to just talk a little bit about how your experience as an immigrant has impacted your feelings of self-worth, your feelings of worthiness, and, how you engage, right, at work and sort of in school and all of these other spaces.
Yeah, and I'll say this, that there are people, experts that study psychology of immigration and its impact on immigrant communities, and I'm sure they do a great job. But I'll share from my experience, right? So this month makes 20 years that I came to America at the age of 16, right? And maybe it's a couple of ways that it's impacted me, right? I grew up in the most populous Black nation on earth, which is Nigeria. And so as a Black woman now in America, right, when I moved here was the first time I actually had to sit with the color of my skin and how the world might or might not receive me differently than, when I was in Nigeria. And that was a whole new experience. I think being an immigrant has made me question whether I belong in certain spaces, whether people can first even just understand me when I came with my Nigerian accent, right? How can I express myself? Because I think one of the things that does is that you can start to lose your voice when you don't think people will give you the time and space to hear your voice. I think there's also been the pressure to assimilate, right? Yet hang on to my cultural identity and finding that balance. And I think that there is no playbook for navigating this experience. And in my first years, I didn't even know that I was navigating this. I was just trying to survive. Again, it's when I graduated college and had to sit with all these things. And even George Floyd was a big reevaluation time for me as well, right? So those are just some of the ways being an immigrant has influenced my self-worth journey, or even what I thought my self-worth was, and how that can change based on where you are.
Yeah. It sounds like sort of finding who you are and how you feel about yourself in the midst of all of these different messages, while you're also navigating a different culture and noticing how other people see you in a different way than you see you. Right? Because as you're sort of alluding to, when you were in Nigeria, you weren't like, I identify as a Black woman, right? Like
No,
you were
I mean,
you.
we're all Black.
Right.
So,
Like you were D, navigating.
Yes,
And maybe there were some, cultural specificities and other parts of your
Correct,
identity that
correct,
stood out for
correct.
you. But the racial piece was not,
Yeah,
a big part of your identity. And then you're thrown into the deep
correct.
end, into a country where race is a big deal. And
Race comes first in America. Yes.
and people talk to you and listen and think about you differently. And you're also in a country
Yes.
that is not so welcoming of immigrants, right? There's a lot of immigrants
Correct.
in the US, but unfortunately we
Yes.
we don't open our arms wide to all immigrants coming to the United States. And
Correct.
so then that's another layer
Correct.
of,
Correct.
what are people thinking of me? And I think what you said about the risk of losing your voice when you're worried that other people won't hear you or won't listen to you, right, is so meaningful, right? And I think there's probably a lot of ways that people experience that, even if they're not immigrants,
Yes.
this feeling like you have to
Yes.
hide or tone down your voice or tone down what you have to say
Yes.
because the environment you're in is not welcoming who you are or what you have to say or what you have to contribute.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think, in those spaces, it's so important for us to work to remind ourselves that just because this environment may not be welcoming or just because this environment may not accept and affirm who we are, that doesn't mean that who we are is a problem. It means that this environment
Correct.
has an issue. This culture has an issue.
Correct.
The issue is not me.
Correct.
The issue is the outside of me. And I can still affirm myself and find my voice and affirm my voice, even if the people in these spaces are not totally embracing that.
Yeah, and I think for me, I didn't always have the courage to do that. But I think I tried, but I would always be in my head, like even like showing up at work, corporate America. I've been there for now almost 13 years. I used to schedule out my hair appointments or plan out my hair schedule for the year to make sure that the ones that were more acceptable were the ones when I was going to work, and then when I was going on vacation, I got wild with the colored braids.
Yes.
And it's funny when I actually, now at work, I have these conversations. They're not easy, but they're necessary.
Yep.
And I think because I'm at a place where personally I'm okay to have those conversations because I know there's somebody else that doesn't have the courage to,
Yep.
or is not yet ready to be, because it's being vulnerable. It's emotional energy in a place where you don't know how it'll be received.
Yes.
And so I have those conversations, and I talked about it at work, to talk about, and maybe it was 4 years ago, I talked about how I plan my hairstyles around work. And my colleagues, mostly white, were absolutely shocked.
Mind blown.
And the next time I show up with my purple braids, because you know what? I want to get to a space where the next young Black hire doesn't have to worry about this because they see me with my blonde hair and I just exist, and just by my presence, I empower them to be, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that it is really powerful and courageous for you to have those conversations, right? And, it's about hair, which we know for Black people is a big deal, right? They're just recently passed the Crown Act that says you cannot discriminate against us because of our hair, right? And the fact that even has to be a law enacted, that you cannot fire Black people because their hair doesn't look the way you want it to, is a big deal. And so the fact that you're saying, hey, I'm going to have a conversation about how I'm tailoring my hair, and then I'm actually going to boldly step in and come into the office with my purple braids or my blonde whatever, and and that takes this courage to say, I'm going to be my full self here. And I think so often for us, we have to spend a lot of time building social capital, showing that we can do the work, showing that we are more than competent, showing that we can do all exactly. And then we say, okay, I can bring a little bit more of myself, because you all know for sure, without a shadow of a doubt, that I can do the work, and I do the work very well. And so you can't question that. And that often is the process that so many of us have to go through. Yeah. I wonder if there were sort of narratives that you adopted yourself, that you heard from your family or spaces you were in about being an immigrant, that you needed to dismantle, whether there were either things that you wanted to embrace that were really helpful or things that you wanted to dismantle or let go of.
I think there are lots of things to dismantle and let go of. And I think one that I think I relate to, and a lot of immigrants relate to, is just that the burden is on me to make certain sacrifices worth it. Right. And so my parents did not move here from Nigeria. They still live in Nigeria, but they sacrificed a lot for me to be able to be here, to get an American education. It was blood, sweat, and tears. Like everybody in my family contributed to my tuition, and it truly took a village. And there are other immigrants where their parents moved here and left their family and friends and everything that they knew. And so, we often feel that it is the burden is on us to make it worth it for them, right? Especially by doing well in school and getting a good career, right? I think the other thing I've had to dismantle is that, that I deserve to be here, right? Especially in America. And I don't have to tick the boxes of a good immigrant, because I think I went down the path of being that model immigrant, getting good grades, not getting in trouble, and doing all these things, and I think, the society isn't always, welcoming regardless. I did all the right things, yet it took me 19 years to become a legal permanent resident in America. And so I think for me, I left America to move for work with my firm to Europe. And I think leaving America, I love America. I grew up here in a way. I became an adult here. But leaving America sometimes had helped me appreciate America for what it is and for what it isn't. And maybe solidified my stance that I deserve to be here, right? And I am worthy as I am, whether or not I tick this 10,000 boxes of what whoever decided a good immigrant is. Another thing that I had to, dismantle was just that I have to prove a point to anyone to be successful, to pick specific successful career paths, right? And these pressures can come, like I said, parental pressures, or even just cultural, or even internal. Because sometimes, even where there is no parental pressure, sometimes there's something ingrained in us to be the best and keep pushing. That's just another example of what that comes to mind. I think maybe one more that comes to mind is maybe not specific to me, but I think in immigrant communities quite common, is that the belief that we have to be, better than the next person, because a lot of our parents are always comparing us, right? And so having to compete with that next person, right? And even just, dismantling the guilt from the pressure of navigating two different cultures. And the responsibility to be our parents' retirement plan, because for many parents that's the belief, that's the expectation.
You're who they invested in financially, and the retirement is going to pay out eventually.
Yep. I think the last belief is just letting go of thriver's guilt, because I think sometimes when you end up coming to the other side. And I think guilt is not always bad, because guilt can be a check to be like, there's a healthy version of guilt that can course correct your behavior, but there's unhealthy guilt that you can carry on and be a burden for forever. Like comparing to be like, I'm further ahead than this other person. How should I do this? How should I do that? Or why did I survive? Why did I make it compared to this other person? So I think there's a lot to let go of. I feel like it's a lot of this.
No, I think that makes so much sense. And you're sort of connecting to this, you're calling it thriver's guilt. I've heard it called survivor's guilt, which is sort of, how am I here and, doing well when I have family members or cousins or just people in my community who have not had the same opportunities and maybe struggling or having a hard time. And I think, part of the challenge with sort of claiming our worthiness is, or one of the sort of important pieces to remember is that you're not saying I'm more worthy than someone else. You're not saying I deserve this and they didn't, or I'm better than them and that's why I got this. You're saying I'm worthy and they're equally as worthy, right? Like we're all worthy.
Absolutely.
It's not, that I'm better, and I can sort of hold and appreciate and have gratitude for these opportunities, these privileges, these blessings, while also, feeling sadness for the fact that everybody didn't have these opportunities, right? And then I know really bright and brilliant and wonderful people who weren't able to come to the US or, weren't able to go to this school or weren't able to do some of these things. And that's the sort of task of holding all of that together.
Yeah. No, I think you nailed it.
Yeah. And so I'd love for you to also talk a little bit more about like, what does it mean for you to be a rich immigrant, right? So I love that you use that word rich, right? Like, what does that mean to you?
Yeah, and when I was thinking for a name for it, I thought, well, when people think about, immigrants, you think about hustle and hard work and multiple jobs and back breaking work. And there might be some truth to that. And so I thought, well, how do I want to change the narrative of what it means to be an immigrant? And so I said, well, we're going to be the rich immigrant, because I think immigrants can. And when I think of myself as a rich immigrant, I think of myself as someone that's empowered and informed to live a full, rich life. I think when it comes to, there's of course, there's a finance focus on that, because I think, I didn't know anything about money coming to America. Everything I learned by trial and error, and a lot of error. And I know that there's a lot of shame around money and shame around not knowing about money. And so I wanted to create a platform where we could have these money conversations with, to help first and second generation immigrants just know how to handle money, so that money has become more of a tool than something that controls us. But beyond money, just making sure we talk about all these things that can help us live a richer, fuller life and just show up authentically wherever we are.
Yeah,
so that's
I love that. I love that rich encompasses money and also a full life, and that it's sort of this counterpoint to hustle culture, always working, all this stuff. My dad emigrated from Jamaica, and there's a joke around about Jamaicans that they always have 3 jobs, right? Like they're always got to have 3 jobs. You can't just have one,
Yeah.
Right. So, and there is, and I think I saw that in my dad, like he was always working very hard. Right. And there also was like, he did very well for himself. He's, built, wealth. And I think that there's always sort of this underlying feeling of maybe it can be taken away. Maybe it's not quite enough. You still got to be really conservative. And he's, very wise, but there is, I think, that sense that comes with you around, like, especially like my dad grew up pretty poor, right? So especially if you come from a community that didn't have a lot, or where your family didn't have a lot, coming to this space of, how do you embrace the richness? How do you embrace the abundance, right? And how can you sort of get comfortable with it, and not sort of continue to feel like you've got to hustle in an unhelpful way, even when you're sort of enjoying some riches.
Yeah.
Well, I think one of the things that feels interesting to me is that you sort of are at this intersection of, helping people with their personal finances, but also working for a major company that does financial, banking and financial things, like a multinational company, right? And I guess I wonder if there's anything that you see that might surprise us. So like, I guess I'm guessing that you might see scarcity, even when you're dealing with millions and maybe even billions of dollars, right? That even in that world, can be a sense of scarcity, even though the amount of money that people have or companies have is incredible, right? For most of us. And then you also work with people to sort of embrace the richness of life and build a financial foundation in their individual lives. So the scale is much smaller, but I'm imagining that there are sort of some similarities that you might see. So I wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think, I try to separate what I do 9 to 5 from like my podcast and that platform. But, I think it's interesting. So I'm in the audit practice. So I audit large banks. That's what I do. And so I get to see, kind of what they're doing from a strategy standpoint. And also, well, clearly I'm looking at their numbers and how they're thinking about that. And, I think about how, CEOs of companies think strategically and how they're trying to plan. They're not just planning for today or tomorrow. They're having a longer term view, right? And I think when you're able to think strategically, you're able to make better choices. And when I think about things from a personal finance standpoint in the immigrant community, like a lot of us are in survival mode. And when you're in survival mode, you're not able to think long term, right? And I think even companies that are in survival mode, they're just trying to make it to the next day and to not go bankrupt. And so for me, what I see is I want to help our communities to always be able to be strategic and think long term and get out of survival.
Yeah, I so appreciate you sharing that. And I think, where there can be sort of an intersection between the work that we do, you and I do, is a lot of the practices that help people to embrace their self-worth are grounding, soothing practices, right? When our nervous system is on edge, right? Like when our nervous system is activated and we think, oh my God, I don't have enough money. I don't know if I can make rent. I mean, I've experienced that. Like that experience of like, oh crap, like is rent at groceries? Okay, ramen, right? Like that feeling activates your nervous system, right? And it tells your body we're not safe. Yeah. We're not okay. Survival. Yeah. And survival mode is important because if you need to survive on very little, it's important that you be in a space where you're not like, sure, I'll go get my nails done for $50. I don't know if I can make rent. Like, there's some utility to it, but we don't want to be there long term. And also, as you're saying, when we're in that activated state, we can't think strategically. We can think, what can I do right now? Yeah. What can I do in the next hour and maybe tomorrow? But we can't think, okay, this is an investment. This is how I'm saving. This is right. And so some of this
is the big picture. You can't see the big picture when you're just trying to not.
Exactly. And so even the things of like, slowing down, meditating, offering self-compassion, being kind to yourself instead of beating yourself up, like we were talking about earlier, that helps us to calm down and feel like, okay, let me think through this, right? Because what happens is when we're overwhelmed, let's say you realize your bank account is really low and then you get overwhelmed and then you start beating yourself up, right? Then it's really hard to think through anything. But if you could calm yourself down by saying, okay, it's okay, right? Like, you're okay. Like many people have experienced this before. It doesn't make you bad or unworthy. Then you're calm enough. Your prefrontal cortex comes back online and you can actually engage in strategic thinking about, okay, what are the options I have to deal with this? And then beyond that, how do I want to build wealth? How do I want to build a rich life, right? And move out of the survival mode long term.
And one of the things I talked about, when I said I was going to start a podcast, I said the first thing I have to talk about is money mindset. And I kind of dug deep into that topic. And I actually ended up calling my sister to just have conversations about how we grew up thinking about money and how that impacted us, as adults. And I was even able to see that sometimes, of course, how we think about money, how we treat money, whether we have a scarcity or abundance mindset, a lot of it is rooted in, how we were raised and what we experienced growing up. Like if you grew up in a time of war versus a time of peace, if you grew up in a poor household or in a country where there was no infrastructure, if you grew up with parents that, didn't know how to manage money, or if you had one parent that managed money well and the other that blew everything, all of those things would impact how we react to money, how we treat money, how we see money, whether we're afraid of it, whether we're always trying to hoard it. And so I had that conversation with my sister and then came back and had a podcast conversation and just kind of talked through maybe just questions to think through kind of why we've gotten to where we are. And some of it was rooted in how we grew up and our parents thought about money very differently. And I think that was helpful to see because I then chose, even without knowing, and my sister was like, you chose to be more like mom when it comes to money versus dad, right? And then I came to America and then I had instances like you're talking about where I could either pay rent or buy food. I couldn't do both. And I would choose one or the other, or I chose to pay the rent. And then, I put groceries on my credit card. And so I had, I think it's how we grew up. It's the circumstances that then continue in our lives and things that work for us or things that don't work out for us. They inform kind of how we treat money. And if we don't heal, kind of, if we have a, scarcity mindset or, and one that's rooted in a lot of pain and fear, if we don't start at the core and heal that, I think we pass it on to the next generation.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I also think it, the thought I'm coming up with, and I think you mentioned this earlier, is like the shame, right? And so often there is a lot of shame around money challenges, around having debt, right? Around all of these things. And, we don't, in the US, we don't really talk about money openly. And then everybody, like people are sort of like carrying credit card debt and feeling ashamed and feeling like, oh gosh. And when we have shame, we want to hide things. But I'm guessing that in your work, it's like when you hide the credit card debt and you just don't look at the bill and you just kind of pay the minimum, that's when it kind of festers, right? But you have to start looking at it. And that's where self-compassion can be so helpful to actually turn around and like, let's sit down and look at it. And yes, you may have made some decisions that might not have been the most wise, or maybe you made decisions that were understandable given like what you're saying, the family, exactly, the circumstances, the family you grew up in, what you had access to. So can you forgive yourself? Can you be kind? And then how do we take it from here? And that, it sounds like a lot of the work that you help people do is like, okay, let's moving forward, how do we create a path to a rich life?
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. And I think I even talk about how when I was paying off debt, I still had that shame that I did not even tell my best friends. They did not know for 2 years I was paying off all my debt. And I didn't tell anyone. I just put my head down and paid it off. And it was even like 9 years later or 8 years later, one of my best friends and her husband were paying off their mortgage. And she was like, oh, you're debt free. I'm like, I've been debt free for 8 years. And she did not know. It just shows how bad it can be that even our closest circles don't know.
Yeah, it's huge. And so for you to create a platform where you're talking about it and helping people to talk about it, I think is really powerful. You know, I think there's, you know, on the surface, everybody will agree, like, yeah, I'd like to have a lot of money. I'd like to have financial independence. I'd like to be debt free. But I'm wondering how you see that relating to people being able to live authentically and live sort of the rich life beyond just the money piece.
Yeah. And I think, you know, before I dive into this question, I want to be clear, you know, that your net worth is not your self-worth. It never is. They're two different things, right? So don't go chasing the high net worth when you haven't worked through your self-worth. And ultimately, I believe that money is a tool. And, you know, how can it help us, live rich lives or live authentically? You know, I think money is a tool that can make a difference. But money is not the ultimate goal. And for me, a certain number is not the ultimate goal for me, right? But I think it is about the freedom and the power to make choices and decisions about your life, right? And your work and how you spend your time. Because I think when you're making decisions from a place of power, from a place of choice, you move differently.
That's a true money move. I think you're so right, is that it's easier to step into your power when you're feeling worthy. And I also think that when you're in that space, that's when you're in a position to attract more money, to make more money, to earn more money with ease. Exactly, right. To do it while also feeling good, not like working yourself into the ground, you know, working 100 hours a week, exhausted, and your bank account looks good, but like feeling good and making the money, right? Like all of those things come together when you're, you know, when you feel worthy. And, you know, I think the other thing is, I think often when people, if you feel unworthy of having money because you don't truly feel worthy at your core, you're probably not going to keep the money. The money may come and then it may go real quick.
Yeah, because you'll be trying to prove that you deserve the money and then you won't.
I wonder if there are other thoughts or things you want to share with people, or if there are things that you sort of recommend to people, to the people in your community as you advise them on becoming rich immigrants that you think might be helpful for our listeners to hear.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I strongly recommend is to have money conversations. Like, talk about these things. I think one, uncover the stuff in your past that may be impacting how you respond to money today. Right? You know, stuff that happened with your parents, stuff that happened with you, you know, things that did not happen for you that caused you to be a certain way. For me, I think that is the most important starting point. And then beyond that, then talk about money. Like, even when it doesn't feel comfortable, of course, you know, you don't have to, I mean, you'll know the people that you should talk about money to, because the people that just want to know, how much do you make? What do you do? How much do you buy that? And that's not productive, right? But have the courage to have the conversation. Ask people that are doing things that, you know, you're like, oh, I'd like to do that. Ask people how they've done that. You know, just listen to podcasts and listen to people's different journeys, right? Because you don't have to do what others are doing. But I think I like to prepare myself for the next step, right? So what can I learn about from what this person has done? And I think about it like a buffet, right? When I started trying to figure out how to pay off debt, there was nobody that had my similar life experiences, because I know immigrants have, you know, family responsibilities, all that stuff, immigration paperwork that also kind of impacts our financial journeys. But nobody in my world was talking about it. So I found people that were mostly white young people talking about budgeting and all that stuff. And yes, I couldn't relate to their life experiences, and they almost always had more money than I did. I was working in a factory making $10 an hour as a college graduate at the time. But I think that there's always, I think of it as a buffet. You know, take what you like, take what serves you, and leave the rest. So I think have the money conversations, just make it part of kind of things that you do, and then pick up what serves you and leave the rest. And you don't have to be obsessed about money. You can just take what you need to learn and apply that to your life and automate it and just move forward. You know, there are communities that, you know, encourage people to have conversations. People talk about their debt and all that stuff. So, you know, I think having a community, I think for me, it would have made a big difference. And so if you can find a community, I would say plug yourself, you know, into one of those. We can talk to people and celebrate your journey, celebrate the milestones. And maybe just off, you know, I know you were going to talk about hustle culture among
immigrant go ahead.
You're going to ask that question.
Yeah.
I do want to talk about that.
Here, before you get into that, let me just say, like, I think what you're saying makes so much sense is like figuring out what works for you and having conversations. I know one of the things that was really powerful for me in my journey with money, budgeting, finances, that a good friend of mine and I decided to be budget accountability partners. So we would meet, I think it was either every 2 weeks or every month at first. And we'd like go over our budgets, talk about our challenges, talk about our savings goals, and we'd work on it together. And it was so helpful to just have somebody who I could honestly talk to about money and budgeting and the struggles and the challenges and paying off debt and all of those things. And so I agree with you that finding community can be really important and really powerful in the process. And then I think the other piece you're touching on is try not to compare yourself, right? Because if you are an immigrant and you are expected to be your parents' retirement plan, your goals financially and what you're going to have the flexibility to do are going to be different, because that may be something that you really value, wanting to take care of your parents, knowing that they sacrificed for you, that they poured into you, that was a huge investment, and that you want to be able to take care of them when they're ready to retire or settle down. And so not comparing yourself to somebody who doesn't have that same responsibility, I think is really important, and not shaming yourself like, oh, well, I'd be further along, or I shouldn't. Like, you have your own unique experience, right? And there are values that you're holding and cultural mandates and family expectations that you're upholding that may be important to you, that may be very different from somebody who grew up in the US.
Yes, absolutely.
And so, you're welcome.
Thank you for pulling that out.
Let's get into the hustle culture, please, because I think that's certainly something that at least I've observed. Like I mentioned sort of with my dad and with immigrants, and I think it also affects a lot of people. So let's talk about sort of the challenge of hustle culture, especially related to finances, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, and this is one that I want to be thoughtful and careful about, because you know, when I think about hustle culture, I think that it means, you know, doing everything fast, being busy at all times, sleeping less, buying more, living more. I mean, not living up to certain expectations, you know. It means, you know, being in the rat race forever and always chasing after the next thing, right? I think it comes from a feeling of, you know, that you're never doing enough. Right. And I think as immigrants, it's not uncommon for us to be working first, you know, multiple jobs to pay for tuition, support family, you know, and so on. And we have had to do that just to keep our heads above water. You know, like I was in college, I was working all summer. Sometimes I would work on a farm to get extra money. And I want to hold space for that, because there's some times where you have to do that just to keep your head above water, just to try to survive. And as much as I understand and respect what we have to do in survival mode, you know, I think sometimes when we get to the other side, we can fall into the habit of continuing to drive ourselves to death, or continuing to act as though we're still in survival mode. And that can be because maybe that's what is celebrated in our communities. That's what's affirmed in our communities, or that's where we find comfort, because that's a zone that we've always operated in. Right. And for me, when I found myself just working myself to the bone, you know, I think I found myself to step away from being sucked in. There's a question I ask myself, you know, what am I doing, to what end, and at what cost? And that always helps me separate, you know, do I need to be doing this, or am I doing it because I think I have to, because of something I created in my head. Right. And so I think it takes practice and intention and hard work to step away from the hustle culture, right? Because it's been ingrained in us forever. And when I think about America and immigrants, in defining the good immigrant works
Mm-hmm.
10,000 jobs to make ends meet. The good immigrants, will work in a hotel and then go
Yeah.
and clean the rooms and will go and do all these things. That's how America has defined a good immigrant. It's
Yeah.
backbreaking hard work. But I think that we can, I want to work hard personally, but I want to live fully. And
Mm-hmm.
so I fight to do both. I want to be centered in my values. And as part of that, I want to know how to manage, the resources that I do have, so that I can work smart. Because I think in the immigrant communities, we work hard, but we don't always take the time to learn how to work smart. And that's why my
Yeah,
platform
so much of
exists.
what you're saying is really powerful and impactful, right? I think it is important to acknowledge that often when immigrants come to the US, the opportunities for employment are underemployment opportunities, right? They're under the level of
Yes.
education, of
Yes.
training, of
Yes.
skill, of
Yes.
knowledge and expertise
Yes.
that an immigrant
Yes.
that person might have been able to do in their home country. And so often the jobs that are available
Yeah.
are jobs that don't pay enough and are jobs that don't adequately utilize their
Yep.
skills, wisdom, knowledge, training. And that creates a situation where you have to have multiple jobs and work many hours
Multiple
in
jobs.
order to make ends meet and cover expenses in this country. And I think it's important to acknowledge the circumstance that that's kind of how America operates, which I think is unfortunate. And I think also what you're saying is, even if you have to do that for a period, how do you come out of that space so you don't carry that same energy of like, got to do all the things, right? Into another period where maybe you get that full-time salary job after you graduated from college, grad school, whatever, right? Like where you're in a space where you don't have to hustle in that same way. Let's not pull and carry that same energy, that same sort of anxiety and stress into that period. And I think it's so insightful, these questions you're saying. I think, what am I doing, to what end, and what is the cost, right? These questions, asking yourself those questions, I think is so important, right? Because sometimes there are hidden costs, right? Mental and emotional costs that we have to continuing to do something. And also just, what am I doing, to what end? Okay, so I'm doing this because I have to for this period of time, because this is what's available to me. Or I'm doing this because I have this idea that I should always be working and I don't know how to rest. And I feel like that's what makes me worthy. And that's the only way I can earn. Right. So like, just taking the time to be analytical, as you said you are, to reflect and say, why am I doing this? What's the cost? It's the mental, the physical cost, the emotional cost. I think that's so helpful for people to start to just dismantle this culture that sort of can run us into the ground and end up making us sick, unhappy, and living the opposite of a rich life.
Of a rich life. Yeah, absolutely. That question has saved me a lot of heartache and has simplified a lot of things that I thought were more complex.
Yeah. Okay. So say the 3 questions one more time so people can be like, okay, I'm going to ask myself these.
So what am I doing? To what end? Which is, why am I doing it? And at what cost? What am I losing by doing this? Because sometimes the cost outweighs the benefit, and we may not realize that if we don't pause before.
I was at my last job and feeling miserable. And I talked to my friend who's also a clinical psychologist, and I was like, but I have, federal loan repayment. Like, I need to stay at a nonprofit. I've got 5 more years. Like, I'm miserable, but I got 5 more years. And she was like, Adia, I think you need to think about the emotional cost. And I was like, ooh. I was like, okay, so I would get the money, the loan repayment, like that would be big, but there's a big emotional cost. And that really...
and are you
right, it was a long time. I didn't. I left in like a year. I probably left like around a year from that conversation, but it was so powerful for me to say, can I figure out how to pay these loans another way? And I'm still working on it. I still got the loans, right? But to think about, this is going to take an emotional toll. And I actually don't think I'm willing to pay that cost. I don't think it's worth it. was
Yes.
such a powerful thing. And I'm so grateful that my
Yes.
friend asked me that question. So I think these questions that you're offering to us are really important. I really hope all of those of you listening, if you're feeling like you're getting caught up in the hustle, like you feel like I have to do that, because that's the other thing. We feel like we have no choice. I have no choice. And so one of the things that's really important is let's highlight the choice. I'm choosing to work at this job. I'm choosing
Yes.
to do these 3 jobs because in this short-term period, I want this. Versus I have no choice. I have to. I'm a victim of it, because that's not helpful. So I think these questions you're suggesting, Dee, will help people to highlight the choices that they have, and then they can choose with intention.
Yes. Thank you. Because I'm also super big on choices and evaluating all the alternatives. And, I think I've been having some things I've been thinking through in my life in the last year. And, a friend of mine brought up an alternative that I had never even considered. And I'm like, this is so black and white. I should have thought about this. But in my mind, there was only 1 or 2 outcomes. And, I think that's also a benefit to having people that know you, and just having life-giving friendships and people that can pour into you and ask you good questions where they're not telling you the answer, but they're giving you good enough questions that will give you pause and have you go back.
And that I think is so important too. It's important to make your own decisions, right? It can feel easy when we're stressed to feel like somebody just tell me what the right answer is. Just tell me what to do. But the real truth is that the right answer is within you, and you're the only one who can come to it. And it does take slowing down, pausing, reflecting, asking yourself questions, and being willing not to know the answer right away. That's okay. So that you can come to a truth that does serve you. Awesome. Yes, well, this has been such a wonderful conversation. I also want to just say, you mentioned that you dove deep into sort of these money mindset discussions on your podcast. So I really think that would be an excellent resource for those people who are listening and you're like, you know what, this podcast episode is making me realize that I have some work to do in terms of my money mindset, my relationship with money. I think your podcast will be an excellent resource. So tell us about your podcast, the name of it, where we can find it, and then how people can connect with you in general.
Yes, I'd love to. So it's called The Rich Immigrant Podcast. So it's a podcast, Instagram, and a website. So all is at therichimmigrant.com is the website, The Rich Immigrant Podcast, on all platforms where you listen to podcasts: Apple, Spotify, Google, Amazon, all of it, or Audible, is that what it's called? And on Instagram, I'm The Rich Immigrant. And the podcast exists to just have money conversations. I break down a lot of money topics. And I also talk about just, things like having money conversations. And the money mindset was the very first episode, season 1, episode 1, because I had to start there because everything else flows from that point. So the podcast comes back at the end of August and for season 6. And so, yes, listen and let me know if you've got questions.
Nice.
I'm more than happy
Thank you so much, Dee. And I so appreciate you taking the time to be here with me and have this conversation. It's been really great.
Thank you.